Dust settled on the crib she built from crates. No one knew she was only 7. Welcome back to our channel, dear listeners. Before we dive into today's heart-wrenching tale from the American Old West, please hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. It truly helps us bring you more stories like this one. And don't forget to comment below, telling us where in the world you're listening from. Are you joining us from a bustling city, a quiet countryside, or perhaps somewhere as remote as the frontier town in our story? We love hearing from our global family, and your support means everything to us. Today's story will take you to a place where survival meant everything, where children grew up too fast, and where love could be found in the most unexpected places. This is the story of little Emma May, a 7-year-old girl whose silent act of devotion would echo through generations. So settle in, close your eyes, and let us transport you to the dusty streets of Millbrook, Colorado, in 1887. This tale will challenge everything you think you know about courage, sacrifice, and the lengths a child will go to protect those they love. The autumn wind of 1887 swept through Millbrook, Colorado, carrying with it the scent of dried sage and the promise of a harsh winter ahead. The town had grown considerably since the silver strike of 1882, with new buildings sprouting along Main Street like wildflowers after rain. But on the outskirts, where the respectable part of town gave way to forgotten corners and abandoned dreams, stood a weathered cabin that time seemed to have overlooked. In the corner of this forgotten dwelling, a small crib sat gathering dust, a peculiar sight that had puzzled the townsfolk for nearly 3 years. The crib was unlike anything the local carpenter, Heinrich Müller, had ever crafted in his 40 years of woodworking. Constructed from old wooden crates that once held supplies from Peterson's general store, it was held together with frayed twine, bent nails, and what appeared to be strips of faded calico fabric. The craftsmanship was crude, yet somehow tender, as if every nail had been driven with love rather than skill. The proportions were slightly off, too narrow here, too wide there, but there was something about its construction that spoke of desperate hope and infinite care. Sheriff Tom Bradley often passed by the cabin during his evening rounds, his horse's hooves echoing hollowly on the hard-packed earth. Each time, his weathered eyes would linger on that strange little bed visible through the broken window. The sight of it never failed to stir something uncomfortable in his chest, a mixture of curiosity and unease that he couldn't quite name. Whose child was meant to sleep there? He wondered aloud to his deputy, Jake Morrison, one particularly cold evening as they rode past. The wind was picking up, whistling through the gaps in the cabin's weathered boards, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled its loneliness to the star-filled sky. "Been wondering the same thing for years, Sheriff," Jake replied, adjusting his coat against the biting wind. His breath formed small clouds in the frigid air as he spoke. "Old Martha from the boarding house says she's seen that crib since they're 84. Whoever built it sure put their heart into it, even if they didn't have the proper tools or know-how." Jake Morrison was a good man, honest and hard-working, but he carried a burden that few in town knew about. His older brother Frank had lived in that very cabin for a brief time, years ago, with a woman named Sarah and her young daughter. Frank had left town suddenly one winter night, and Jake had always wondered what had driven his brother away so abruptly. The cabin itself told a story of abandonment and broken dreams. Its windows were boarded up with rough planks, and the front door hung slightly ajar, creaking with each gust of wind like a mournful song. Weeds had grown tall around the foundation, and the wooden steps had begun to rot, their edges soft and treacherous, yet somehow that little crib remained intact, protected by the cabin's walls from the worst of the weather. The roof leaked in places, and rain had stained the wooden floor in dark patches, but the corner where the crib sat remained mysteriously dry, as if some benevolent force had chosen to preserve this one small sanctuary within the decay. Martha Henderson, the town's unofficial keeper of memories and proprietress of the only boarding house in Millbrook, had indeed been watching that cabin longer than most. At 62, she had seen families come and go, witnessed the boom and bust cycles that defined frontier life. She had watched young couples arrive full of hope and determination, only to leave broken and defeated when the silver ran out or the harsh winters proved too much to bear. But the mystery of the crib haunted her more than any other story she'd collected over the years. It wasn't just the unusual construction that bothered her. It was the feeling that something important had been forgotten, some crucial piece of the town's history that had been allowed to slip away into silence. "There's something about that little bed," she confided to her friend Eleanor Whitman while they sorted through donations for the church one grey afternoon. The two women had been friends for over 20 years, having arrived in Millbrook within months of each other as young brides full of dreams. "It wasn't built by adult hands, I'm certain of it. The proportions are all wrong. And the technique, it's like a child tried to copy what they'd seen grown-ups do." Eleanor paused in her folding, a small baby blanket clutched in her weathered hands. She was a mother of 5, grandmother to 12, and she knew the look of love when she saw it, even in something as simple as a handmade crib. A child. Martha? What child would know how to build a crib? And more importantly, what child would need to? "That's exactly what keeps me awake at night," Martha replied, her weathered hands smoothing a small yellow blanket that had been donated by one of the newer families in town. What child would need to build a bed for a baby? And where are they now? The two women worked in contemplative silence for a while, each lost in their own thoughts. Outside, the wind rattled the windows of the church hall, and they could hear the distant sound of hammering as Heinrich Möller worked on repairs to the schoolhouse roof. As winter approached, the mystery deepened. The crib had become a landmark of sorts, a conversation starter for newcomers and a source of endless speculation for long-time residents. Traveling salesmen would ask about it, and the townspeople would share their theories with the enthusiasm of people who had little else to occupy their minds during the long, cold months. Some believed it was the work of a young mother who had lost her baby to the harsh frontier conditions. Others thought it might have been built by an older sibling, preparing for a new arrival that never came, perhaps lost to one of the many dangers that claimed so many lives in those days: disease, accident, or the simple brutality of frontier existence. The more romantic souls in town, led by the schoolteacher Miss Rebecca Foster, preferred to think it was a symbol of hope, built by someone who believed so strongly in the future that they prepared for it even when circumstances seemed impossible. But none of them suspected the truth, that the crib had been built by 7-year-old Emma May Colton, a child who had disappeared from Millbrook 3 years earlier, under circumstances that the town had collectively chosen to forget. The human mind, Sheriff Bradley had learned over his years of law enforcement, had a remarkable ability to overlook uncomfortable truths, especially when those truths reflected poorly on the community's ability to protect its most vulnerable members. The sheriff had his own theories about the crib, theories he kept to himself during those long evening rides. He remembered the Morrison family, Frank, his pregnant wife Sarah, and the quiet little girl with the serious eyes. He remembered how the child had seemed to carry herself with a gravity that was unusual for someone so young, as if she understood things that children shouldn't have to understand. And he remembered the night Frank Morrison had left town, riding hard and fast like a man fleeing from demons. The sheriff had always wondered what had driven Frank away so suddenly, and whether the little girl's disappearance shortly afterward was connected to her stepfather's abrupt departure. But those were dangerous thoughts, in a town that preferred its mysteries to remain unsolved, especially when the solutions might implicate one of their own. Jake Morrison was a good deputy and a respected member of the community, and no one wanted to believe that his brother might have been capable of something truly terrible. So the crib remained, gathering dust and secrets in equal measure, a silent witness to events that no one wanted to remember and a testament to love that no one understood. It would take the return of someone who had been there, someone who remembered the truth, to finally give voice to the story that the little bed had been keeping all these years. Emma May Colton had arrived in Millbrook in the spring of 1883 with her pregnant mother, Sarah, and her stepfather, Frank Morrison, Jake's older brother, and a man whose reputation for hard drinking and harder fists preceded him wherever he went. Sarah was heavy with child, her belly round with the promise of new life, and despite the uncertainty of their situation, Emma May had been so excited about becoming a big sister that she could barely contain her joy. The journey west had been difficult for Sarah, who was not built for the rigors of frontier travel. She was a delicate woman, raised in the relative comfort of a St. Louis boarding house, and the harsh realities of life with Frank Morrison had already begun to wear on her spirit long before they reached Colorado. But Emma May's enthusiasm for their new life had been infectious, and Sarah had found herself caught up in her daughter's dreams of the adventures they would have as a family. The Morrisons had claimed the abandoned cabin as temporary shelter, while Frank looked for work in the silver mines that dotted the mountainsides around Millbrook. The cabin wasn't much: 4 walls, a leaking roof, and a floor that creaked ominously with every step, but it was theirs, and Emma May had immediately set about making it feel like home. She swept the floors with a makeshift broom, crafted from twigs and twine, arranged their few possessions with the careful attention of a woman 3 times her age, and spent hours talking to her mother's belly, telling the unborn baby about all the wonderful things they would see and do together once it arrived. "The mountains are so tall, baby," she would whisper, her small hands pressed against her mother's swollen abdomen. "And the sky is bigger than anything you can imagine. When you're born, I'll show you everything. I'll teach you about the flowers and the birds, and we'll build snow forts in the winter." Sarah would smile at her daughter's chatter, but Frank's presence cast a shadow over even these tender moments. He had grown increasingly volatile as his job prospects dwindled, and his drinking had become a daily ritual that transformed him from merely unpleasant to genuinely dangerous. "Mama, when the baby comes, where will it sleep?" Emma May had asked one evening as Sarah rested on their single bed, her back aching from the weight she carried. The question was innocent enough, but it highlighted a problem that had been weighing on Sarah's mind for weeks. They had so little, barely enough blankets for themselves, let alone a proper bed for a newborn. The nearest town with a real store was a 2-day ride away, and they had no money for such luxuries, even if they could make the journey. Sarah's face had grown troubled as she considered their options. "We'll figure something out, sweetheart," she had promised. But Emma May could hear the worry in her voice, the uncertainty that her mother tried so hard to hide. "Maybe we can ask Mr. Muller to build something simple, or perhaps one of the church ladies will have something we can borrow." But Emma May was a practical child, wise beyond her 7 years, and she could see the strain in her mother's eyes. She knew that Frank spent what little money they had on whiskey, and she had heard the arguments between her parents about their dwindling resources. If the baby was going to have a proper bed, Emma May realized she would have to provide it herself. That night, as her parents slept, Frank snoring off his latest drinking bout and Sarah finally finding some relief from the constant ache in her back, Emma May had crept outside to explore the area behind Peterson's general store. Mr. Peterson was a kind man who had told her she could take whatever she needed from the refuse pile, where he discarded broken crates and damaged goods. Most children would have looked for toys or treasures among the discarded items, but Emma May saw something different: the makings of a bed for her future sibling. The crates were sturdy, made from good pine that had traveled hundreds of miles to reach this remote outpost. Some were damaged, but many were simply empty, their contents sold and their purpose fulfilled. Working by moonlight, her small hands guided by determination and love, she had dragged the sturdiest crates back to the cabin. The work was exhausting for someone so small, and she had to make multiple trips, carefully selecting pieces that would fit together and support the weight of a sleeping baby. Over the following weeks, whenever her parents were distracted or away, she worked on her secret project. She had watched Frank repair their table with grudging attention, noting how he measured twice before cutting and how he tested each joint before moving on to the next. She had paid attention when Heinrich Müller worked on the church steps, observing how he chose his nails and how he angled his hammer for the best results. Slowly, Painstakingly, she began to construct her gift. The work was hard for small hands that had never held tools designed for adult use. She used rocks to pound bent nails straight, tied knots with twine she had found blowing around the town, and even tore strips from her own worn petticoat to reinforce the joints where the wood didn't quite fit together properly. Her fingers were often scraped and bleeding from the rough wood and sharp metal, but she persevered, driven by a love so pure and focused that it seemed to guide her inexperienced hands. Each evening, she would examine her progress with the critical eye of a master craftsman, adjusting and improving until she was satisfied with her work. The crib took shape slowly, its unusual proportions reflecting both Emma May's limited understanding of construction and her unlimited determination to create something beautiful for her brother or sister. She lined the bottom with soft fabric salvaged from her mother's old dresses, creating a nest that would be comfortable and warm for a tiny baby. Frank Morrison, however, was not the man Sarah had hoped he would be when she married him in a moment of desperation after Emma May's father died. As the weeks passed and his job prospects dwindled, he began drinking even more heavily than before. His temper, always quick to flare, became genuinely dangerous, and both Sarah and Emma May learned to read the signs of his approaching rages. Emma May became expert at making herself invisible when Frank was in one of his moods, slipping away to work on her crib or simply hiding until the storm passed. But she couldn't always protect her mother, and as Sarah's pregnancy progressed, Frank's resentment seemed to grow along with her belly. Another mouth to feed, he would mutter, glaring at Sarah's swollen form with undisguised hostility. As if we don't have enough problems already. Sarah tried to shield Emma May from the worst of Frank's behavior, but the little girl was observant and intelligent, and she understood far more about their situation than her mother realized. She knew that Frank blamed the coming baby for their problems, and she worried constantly about what would happen when her sibling finally arrived. The night Sarah went into labor, Frank was nowhere to be found. He had stormed out after another argument about money, heading for the saloon with the last of their cash, leaving his pregnant wife alone with a 7-year-old child as her only help. Emma May, barely 7 years old, found herself thrust into a situation that would have challenged an adult. As her mother's contractions began in earnest, she tried to remember everything she had seen when Mrs. Patterson had helped deliver the blacksmith's baby the previous summer. She boiled water, as she had seen the town midwife do, gathered clean rags from their meager supply of linens, and held her mother's hand through the long, terrifying night. Sarah was brave, trying not to frighten her daughter with her pain, but Emma May could see the fear in her mother's eyes as the hours stretched on, and Frank failed to return. "It's going to be all right, Mama," Emma May whispered, though she was terrified herself. "The baby's going to be beautiful, and I'm going to take such good care of both of you." When dawn broke over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, Sarah Colton Morrison was dead, and a tiny, premature baby boy lay crying weakly in Emma May's arms. The child was so small, so fragile, that Emma May feared he might break if she held him too tightly. His skin was translucent, and she could see the delicate network of veins beneath the surface. But he was alive, and he was hers to protect now. In that moment, as she looked down at her baby brother's wrinkled face, Emma May felt a love so fierce and protective that it transformed her from a child into something else entirely, a guardian, a protector, a mother in everything but name. She had carried her baby brother to the crib she had built with such care and hope, wrapping him in the softest fabric she could find. The little bed fit him perfectly, as if she had somehow known exactly what size he would be. For 3 precious days, she cared for him alone, feeding him drops of milk from Mrs. Patterson's cow, singing lullabies her mother had taught her, and promising him that everything would be all right. "I'm your big sister," she whispered to him as he slept in the crib she had made, "and I'm going to protect you forever. No one will ever hurt you while I'm here." But Frank returned on the 4th day, drunk and angry, and looking for someone to blame for the disaster his life had become. When he saw what had happened, his wife dead and a crying infant in a makeshift crib, His rage was terrible to behold, and MMA's world shattered like glass. Frank Morrison's return changed everything in ways that MMA's young mind could barely comprehend. The sight of his dead wife and the crying infant sent him into a fury, unlike anything MMA had ever witnessed. Even during his worst drinking bouts, in his drunken grief and rage, he seemed to transform into something inhuman. His face twisted with an emotion that was part sorrow, part anger, and part something darker that MMA couldn't name. "To get that thing out of here!" he had screamed, his words slurred and his eyes wild with a madness that terrified the little girl. "It killed her. That cursed thing killed my Sarah." MMA had clutched her baby brother tighter, backing toward the corner where the crib stood like a fortress of love in a world gone mad. The baby was crying, sensing the tension and fear that filled the small cabin, and MMA tried desperately to soothe him while keeping herself between him and Frank's rage. "He's just a baby, Frank," she had said, her voice small but determined. "He's my brother. Mama wanted him. She loved him already." But Frank was beyond reason, lost in a grief and fury that had been building for months and had finally found a target. In his twisted logic, the baby was responsible for everything. Sarah's death, their poverty, his failures, and his pain. The infant represented everything that had gone wrong in his life, and in his drunken state, destroying the baby seemed like the only way to make the pain stop. He grabbed the infant from MMA's arms with rough hands, ignoring her desperate pleas and the baby's frightened cries. What happened next would haunt MMA for the rest of her life, playing out in her nightmares with vivid, terrible clarity. "I'm taking this thing where it belongs," Frank had snarled, his grip on the baby careless and dangerous. "Should have died with its mother. Nature knows what's right." MMA knew, with the terrible intuition that children sometimes possess, that her brother would never return if Frank took him away. She could see it in Frank's eyes, hear it in his voice. This wasn't about finding the baby a home or getting help. This was about eliminating what Frank saw as the source of his problems. "Please, Frank," she begged, tears streaming down her face. "Please don't hurt him. I'll take care of him. You won't even know he's here, please." But Frank was already heading for the door, the baby clutched in his arms like an unwanted burden. MMA followed them into the night, staying hidden in the shadows as Frank stumbled toward the edge of town. The moon was full, casting everything in silver light, and she could see her brother's tiny form in Frank's arms. What she witnessed by the old creek would break something inside her that would never fully heal. Frank Morrison, in his grief and madness, made a choice that would damn his soul and shatter a little girl's world forever. The details were too terrible for her young mind to fully process, but the result was clear. Her baby brother was gone, and Frank Morrison was a murderer. MMA ran back to the cabin, her small body shaking with shock and grief that threatened to tear her apart. She climbed into the crib she had built with such love and hope, curling up in the space meant for her brother, and cried until she had no tears left. The fabric still smelled like him, still held the warmth of his tiny body, and she pressed her face against it as if she could somehow bring him back through sheer force of will. When Frank returned hours later, he found her there. His rage had burned out, replaced by a cold realization of what he had done and what it meant for his future. But instead of remorse, he felt only the need to cover his tracks and eliminate any evidence of his crime. "And do you tell anyone what happened tonight, and I'll do the same to you," he threatened, his voice deadly quiet in a way that was somehow more terrifying than his earlier screaming. "Your brother never existed. Your mother died in childbirth, and the baby died with her. That's the story. And if you ever say different, you'll join them both. Do you understand me?" MMA nodded, too terrified and heartbroken to speak. She understood that her life now depended on keeping Frank's secret, on pretending that the most important 3 days of her life had never happened. She understood that she was now completely alone in the world, with no one to protect her from the man who had murdered her brother. For weeks, MMA lived in that cabin with Frank, keeping his terrible secret like a poison that ate away at her from the inside. She stopped speaking almost entirely, communicating only in nods and shakes of her head when absolutely necessary. The townspeople, when they saw her at all, assumed she was simply grieving her mother's death. They had no idea about the baby, no idea about the horror she carried inside her small chest like a stone. The crib remained in the corner, a monument to love and loss that only Emma May understood. She would sit beside it for hours, running her small hands over the rough wood, remembering the 3 precious days when she had been a big sister. She would whisper stories to the empty space, telling her brother about her day, about the weather, about anything that came to mind. Frank's drinking grew worse, and his treatment of Emma May became increasingly cruel. He seemed to see her as a living reminder of his crime, and his guilt manifested as anger toward the only witness to his actions. He stopped providing for her properly, leaving her to fend for herself, while he spent his days at the saloon and his nights in drunken stupors. Emma May learned to survive on scraps, to make herself invisible, to endure. She foraged for berries and edible plants, begged occasional meals from kind neighbors who thought she was simply a neglected child, and slowly wasted away as Frank's neglect took its toll on her small body. But she never stopped loving the brother she had lost, and she never stopped tending to the crib she had built for him. She would dust it carefully with a rag torn from her dress, adjust the small blanket she had placed inside, and whisper stories to the empty space where he should have been sleeping. "I'm sorry I couldn't protect you," she would whisper during her daily vigils. "I tried so hard, but I wasn't strong enough. I should have been stronger." The guilt was almost unbearable for someone so young. She blamed herself for not fighting harder, for not finding a way to save her brother, for surviving when he hadn't. The weight of Frank's secret and her own perceived failures pressed down on her like a physical burden, making it hard to breathe, hard to think, hard to hope for anything better. The breaking point came on a cold November night when Frank, in a drunken stupor, decided that the crib was a liability, evidence that needed to be destroyed. He stumbled into the cabin with an axe, his eyes wild and unfocused, and began swinging at the little bed that Emma May had built with such love. "Should have done this months ago," he muttered, his words slurred and his movements unsteady. "Damn things like a gravestone, reminding me." Emma May threw herself between him and her creation, her small body shielding the wooden frame from his drunken assault. The axe blade whistled past her head, close enough that she could feel the wind of its passage, but she didn't move. "Please, Frank," she whispered, the first words she had spoken in weeks. "It's all I have left of him. Please don't take that away too." Something in her voice, or perhaps the sight of her protecting the crib with her life, stopped Frank's hand, but his expression was murderous, and Emma May knew that her time in Millbrook was over. If she stayed, Frank would eventually kill her, either in a rage or simply to eliminate the last witness to his crime. That night, as Frank lay passed out on the floor, Emma May made her decision. She kissed the crib goodbye, her tears falling on the wood she had shaped with such hope, and whispered a final promise to her baby brother. "I'll come back someday," she promised. "I'll come back and tell everyone about you, and make sure you're remembered. I swear it." She slipped out into the darkness, taking nothing with her but the clothes on her back and a small piece of fabric torn from the crib's blanket. She was 7 years old, alone in the world, and carrying a secret that would have destroyed a grown man's sanity. But she was also Emma May Colton, and she had survived this long by being stronger than anyone had a right to expect. The frontier was waiting for her, vast and dangerous and unforgiving, but somewhere out there was a future where she could honor her brother's memory and find the strength to return and tell the truth. She just had to survive long enough to reach it. Emma May Colton vanished from Millbrook on November 15th, 1884, taking nothing with her but the clothes on her back and a small piece of fabric torn from the crib's blanket. She was 7 years old, alone in the world, and carrying a secret that would have destroyed a grown man's sanity. But she was also a survivor, forged in the crucible of loss and hardened by experiences that no child should ever have to endure. For 3 years, she wandered the frontier, surviving through a combination of luck, kindness from strangers, and a determination that seemed impossible for someone so young. The American West in the 1880s was no place for a child alone. It was a land of harsh weather, dangerous men, and unforgiving circumstances that claimed the lives of grown adults with frightening regularity. But Emma May had been forced to grow up the night her brother died, and she possessed a wisdom and resilience that served her well in her journey. She learned to read people quickly, to spot the difference between genuine kindness and predatory interest, to make herself useful enough that folks would let her stay for a few days before moving on. She worked in kitchens for scraps of food, her small hands surprisingly capable when it came to washing dishes, peeling potatoes, or sweeping floors. She slept in barns and abandoned buildings, always alert for danger, always ready to run if necessary. She learned to mend clothes with needle and thread, to tend small injuries with herbs and common sense, and to stretch a single meal across multiple days when food was scarce. The frontier was full of people running from something, failed dreams, broken hearts, crimes both real and imagined. Emma May fit in among these wanderers, just another soul seeking something better somewhere else. She never spoke of her past, never mentioned Millbrook or Frank Morrison or the baby brother, whose memory she carried like a sacred flame. Instead, she created a simple story for herself, an orphan whose parents had died of fever, traveling to find relatives in Kansas. It was close enough to the truth to be believable, and it explained her solitary state without raising too many questions. Most people were too busy with their own struggles to probe deeply into the background of a quiet, helpful child who asked for nothing more than a warm place to sleep and a bit of food. She learned to navigate the complex social dynamics of frontier towns, understanding instinctively which families might take her in for a few days and which establishments to avoid entirely. She developed an almost supernatural ability to sense danger, whether it came in the form of violent men, harsh weather, or simple starvation. The winters were the hardest. During her first winter on the road, she nearly died of cold and hunger in the abandoned soddy in Nebraska, saved only by a traveling preacher who found her half frozen and nursed her back to health. The experience taught her to plan ahead, to seek shelter before the weather turned, and to always have an escape route ready. She spent her second winter working in a hotel kitchen in Denver, where the cook, Mrs. O'Malley, took pity on her and let her sleep in the pantry in exchange for washing dishes and scrubbing floors. Mrs. O'Malley was a kind woman who had lost children of her own, and she never asked too many questions about Emma May's past. "You're a good worker, child," Mrs. O'Malley would say, watching Emma May attack a pile of dirty dishes with methodical efficiency. "Someone raised you right, whoever they were." Emma May would nod and smile, but she never elaborated. She had learned that the less she said about her past, the fewer complications arose. People were generally content to fill in the blanks with their own assumptions, and those assumptions were usually kinder than the truth. During her time in Denver, Emma May learned to read and write from a young schoolteacher named Miss Patterson, who volunteered at the local church. Miss Patterson was impressed by Emma May's quick mind and eager attitude toward learning, and she spent many evenings teaching the girl letters and numbers by lamplight. "You have a gift for learning," Miss Patterson told her one evening as they worked through a simple reader together. "With proper schooling, you could make something of yourself. Have you ever thought about what you'd like to be when you grow up?" Emma May considered the question seriously. "I'd like to help children," she said finally. "Children who don't have anyone to take care of them." Miss Patterson smiled, not knowing how deeply personal that ambition was for the quiet girl beside her. "That's a noble calling. The world needs more people who care about children." In the spring of 1887, Emma May finally reached Lawrence, Kansas, where she found her mother's sister, Aunt Catherine, living with her husband Robert on a small farm outside of town. The reunion was both joyful and heartbreaking. Catherine had been searching for Sarah for years, having lost touch when her sister headed west with Frank Morrison. Catherine was a woman in her 40s, childless and kind-hearted, who had always regretted losing contact with her younger sister. When a thin, serious-eyed girl appeared at her door, claiming to be Sarah's daughter, Catherine's heart nearly broke with joy and sorrow combined. "Emma May," she whispered, seeing her sister's features in the child's face. "Oh, my dear child, where have you been? What happened to your mother?" Emma May told her aunt about her mother's death, but said nothing about the baby or Frank's crime. Some secrets were too dangerous to share, even with family, and she had learned to be cautious about trust. Instead, she spoke of her mother's difficult pregnancy, her death in childbirth, and her own subsequent wandering. Catherine and her husband Robert were good people who welcomed Emma May with open arms. They had tried for years to have children of their own, and the arrival of Sarah's daughter felt like a gift from heaven. They asked few questions about her years of wandering, sensing that the child had endured more than anyone should have to bear. Under Catherine's loving care, Emma May began to heal. She learned to read and write properly, helped with the farm work, and slowly started to speak again about normal things, the weather, the crops, the neighbors. But she never forgot her brother, and she never stopped wondering about the crib she had left behind in Millbrook. The nightmares came regularly at first, dreams of that terrible night by the creek, of Frank's rage, of her brother's cries. Catherine would find her sitting up in bed, tears streaming down her face, but Emma May could never explain what had frightened her so badly. "Just bad dreams, Aunt Catherine," she would say. "They'll pass." And gradually they did become less frequent, though they never disappeared entirely. Emma May learned to live with the weight of her secret, to function despite the guilt and grief that she carried. She threw herself into her studies, into helping with the farm, into building a new life with people who loved her. But as the months passed, Emma May grew stronger and more confident. Catherine and Robert treated her as the daughter they had never had, and for the first time since her mother's death, Emma May felt safe and loved. She began to laugh again, to play, to act like the child she had never really been allowed to be. Yet the guilt of leaving her brother's memory behind in that dusty cabin gnawed at her. She had made him a promise to protect him, and even though she had failed, she felt she owed it to him to return and properly honor his brief life. The crib she had built with such love was still there, she knew, still holding the secret of his existence. On her 10th birthday, Emma May made a decision that would have seemed impossible for the frightened 7-year-old who had fled Millbrook 3 years earlier. She asked her aunt and uncle if she could return to Colorado, not to stay, but to face her past and finally lay her brother to rest in her heart. Catherine was reluctant to let her go, understanding instinctively that there was more to Emma May's story than the girl had shared. But she could see the determination in Emma May's eyes, the same fierce love that had driven her to survive 3 years on her own. "Why do you need to go back, sweetheart?" Catherine asked gently. "And what's waiting for you there?" Emma May struggled to find words that would explain without revealing too much. "There's something I left behind," she said finally. "Something important. I made a promise, and I need to keep it." After much discussion and many sleepless nights, Catherine and Robert agreed that Robert would accompany Emma May back to Millbrook. They didn't know what they would find there, but they could see that this journey was necessary for Emma May's healing, even if they didn't understand why. The journey west was long and difficult, but Emma May felt a sense of purpose she hadn't experienced since those 3 precious days when she had been a big sister. She was no longer the helpless child who had fled in the night. She was returning as someone who could finally speak for her brother, someone who could ensure his memory would not be forgotten. As the train pulled into the station at Millbrook in October of 1887, Emma May saw that the town had grown considerably. New buildings lined the main street, and there were faces she didn't recognize, but the mountains looked the same. And somewhere in this place was the cabin that held her most precious and painful memories. She had come home to face the truth, to honor her brother's memory, and to finally find peace with the choices she had made as a frightened 7-year-old child. The crib would be waiting for her, she knew, covered in dust, but still standing, a testament to love that had endured even in the face of unimaginable loss. The reckoning she had promised herself was finally at hand.